Thank you, everybody, for joining. I am Dahlia Shandlin. I am a longtime member and activist at A Land for All. I think since the very beginning, actually, since before we were called A Land for All, since about late 2012, I've been active in advancing, researching, advancing, and advocating the idea of two states in an updated form that involves, that's based on partnership rather than partition. In political science terms, we call it two states in a confederated approach. And A Land for All is the central civil society group of Israelis and Palestinians who are working on this approach. We are grateful that you're joining us because we want to have a chance to both give you a very brief political kind of context setting before we move to a format where I will be interviewing my colleagues, co-directors of the organization, the Israeli and Palestinian directors, Pundak and Rula Hardal. And we're going to try to give you a sense of, first of all, what it is that we're talking about, so we can all be on the same page with the basic framework that we're looking at, and then try to situate it in the context of a very difficult political, regional situation. Of course, it's a time of war. It's been a very, very difficult week for everybody, but then the entire year has been difficult. There's not a lot to give us hope right now, but before I begin with my brief contextual summary, I will just say that, when we are kind of confronting that we're trying to advance what is essentially a peace arrangement, right? It sounds very naive. It sounds almost quaint. And we often get asked, how can you, think about it at a time of war? Whether that's a question from supportive people or critics. It occurred to me that there's an old anecdote about the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir when she first met a young visiting senator, Joe Biden, in the 1970s. She said, "Don't worry, Senator, we'll be okay. We have a secret weapon. We have nowhere else to go." Now, what I have come to realize is that that's true, but it's true for everybody. It's true for Israelis and Palestinians together. None of us have anywhere to go, and we will be here together. The only question is how we will exist here. And so I want to open on that note. We need to be able to reframe what we understood from the past, transform it into more accurate frameworks. There are two people living here who will be living together, and the question is how. So let me start with just a few moments of setting the political context. And before I turn it over, before I move into the interview format, I think that when it comes to what we're looking at, which is how to advance towards a political framework to resolve this conflict, rather than always dealing with the problems through military strategies, or not strategies, military tactics, in fact. We need to realize that for a very long time, there has been no process or even intention, really, certainly on the part of the Israeli government, to reach anything like final status resolution, comprehensive political resolution based on two states. And immediately after October 7th, all of a sudden, the world realized that there was a major crisis here. And very early on, we had global leaders, including US President Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken, and senior figures of the EU and Joseph Borrell and lots of other leaders of individual states, suddenly reviving the realization that there needs to be a comprehensive political resolution, almost always focused on the idea of the two-state solution. And for a short time, I think there were a number of people in the diplomatic community who were convinced, at least in my conversations with them, that this was going to lead to a big breakthrough. What happened instead was the opposite. Very quickly, the Israeli leadership, Netanyahu in particular, began kind of making a concerted effort to hit back against that idea, saying that this would be a reward for terror if there were to be progress towards Palestinian self-determination and statehood. He began telling the Israeli population that he was the only leader in Israel capable of resisting these global forces that might be reviving the idea of a Palestinian state. And what you found, what happened quite quickly was that it seems like the global leaders acquiesced to Netanyahu's perspective rather than leveraging the opportunity of the crisis, which is very tragic to say. But there was an opportunity to make the argument that there is no way out of this crisis except for a long-term conflict resolution. But instead, what we see is that even the language, and the language was still very basic, very almost sloganeering, but even that language eventually dropped out of the conversation from global leaders. You don't hear President Biden saying it anymore. At best, maybe Vice President Harris, candidate for president, but suddenly, after a few months, it seemed to fade all over again. That fading was mirrored back in the region. Certainly among Israelis, there is no serious conversation about long-term political resolution of this conflict. It's just not a conversation people are having. We see in survey research that support for the two-state solution has declined significantly among the Jewish population, who are the majority and the majority of voters. Interestingly, as a side note, well, it's not exactly a side note, it's still another critical piece of the story. What we also see in survey research is that among Palestinians and among Palestinian citizens of Israel, there is actually somewhat of a rise, and even slightly among Israeli Jews, in the number of people who think that is a chance that a Palestinian state will be established in the next 5 years. This is a survey question I've been testing in my own surveys for a few years. And so on the Palestinian side, I think it's partly because there was a revival of this idea around the world. And among the Israeli Jewish side, it's a very small rise, but it does indicate that there is awareness. And I think that that is a space that needs to be leveraged. In other words, even if Israelis aren't talking about it right now, because they're in, the Israeli public is certainly in a kind of survival mode, or at least, they are constantly thinking about the immediate future, whether it's the next few weeks, days, or hours of what will happen. There's just massive levels of grief and trauma among Israelis, and among Palestinians. Of course, the numbers are so much more drastic that every single Palestinian has been affected, particularly in Gaza, but pretty much everywhere. And so nobody, the public is not able to drive a bigger conversation. Israel, which has all of the, the political, military, and economic power, has a coalition, is led by a coalition that does not want or have an interest in advancing comprehensive political resolution based on what we would call a democratic solution, in other words, Palestinian self-determination together with Israel. And the opposition leaders in Israel have completely acquiesced as well. They are afraid, or else themselves not ideologically in favor of it. So what we're looking at is an extremely inhospitable time to be talking about any kind of political resolution to this conflict that's based on principles of self-determination, human rights, justice, equality. Those are not popular themes right now in Israel, and Israel does hold more of the power. And so I think we need to acknowledge that these formidable obstacles, I'm not saying this only to depress everybody, although I'm sure that if you're interested and you're here listening, this is not what you're hoping to hear. But we need to portray this reality, because that creates significant obstacles for any kind of political resolution to the conflict. Whether it's what we consider the old version of a two-state solution developed 25 years ago, which we think desperately needs to be updated, and that's why we've got new ideas, or whether it's any other kind of solution based on agreement and principles of self-determination, equality, justice, etc. All of those political frameworks for ending occupation, resolving the conflict, and providing for Palestinian self-determination will face the same political obstacles from the Israeli side, certainly, and challenges on the Palestinian side as well. And therefore, we try to distinguish. We're here to tell you tonight about our approach, and we think that it is, frankly, more pragmatic and probably the only realistic and viable approach. But that's a discussion we can have. And you will certainly find when you listen to us that there are challenges along the way. But let's distinguish between those that apply no matter what kind of political framework we're looking at, and those that are specific to this particular framework. Now, I'm sure there's questions, but I'd rather move, into the content of our discussion today and give my colleagues as much time as possible, because they're more interesting than me. And I want to start, by making sure that everybody who's joining us today knows what we are talking about. What is this idea of two states that is not based on a hard international partition, but is based on partnership, on a certain measure of power sharing, recognizing interdependence? What does that mean? What are we actually proposing? So our guests, or the people that we're spotlighting tonight, as I mentioned, are the co-directors of A Land for All, Rula Hardal, the Palestinian co-director, and my Pundak, the Israeli co-director. And they have long and very impressive CVs, but I think that they're here in the hat of running the organization that is trying to advance, advocate for, and ultimately, achieve implementation of this idea. So let me start. I'm taking off my analyst hat. I'm putting on my interviewer hat for our conversation. First of all, let me start with my what are the values underlying the approach to this conflict, to this form of resolution? Why have we reconceived of these ideas? And I'm asking you that because then I will turn it to Rula to explain what are the actual items that we're proposing in the political framework. But of course, you can feel free to reverse who takes which topic. But I'd like to start by understanding the values and the basic underlying principles behind this idea.
Thank you, Dalia, and hi, everyone. I think it's important to be together and convene these days, specifically this week. And I think that it's even more remarkable to not only convene, but actually to convene to talk about, this tragedy. And instead of not convening and not being able to address it as hard as it is, I just want to acknowledge that it's difficult, and I appreciate that we are here, because I think that that's already a form of activism and already a form of taking responsibility in a way. So I wanted to start with that. I think I'm going to start elegantly let my partner, Dr. Rula Hardal, to start. Because I think that the values really should come first. And I think, Rula, that you're the right person to talk about them. And then I'll try to translate them into the political program itself so that we're all on the same page as much as can be. So Rula, I'm proud to be here with you, and it's not easy. So thank you.
Thank you, Mai. Thank you, Dalia. Thank you all for being with us this evening. Well, I don't feel that I can jump directly speaking about our political vision without saying a few words about the whole situation. Just being here a year after, and not having any improvement of the situation, it's already sad, and it's not the whole story. We are moving in this place and in the world, speaking about Israel, Palestine, and about the political situation and about the vision that we hold and how much we are convinced that it's doable, it's viable, we can do it. But the reality on the ground is just continue to escalate. The war is expanding to be a kind of regional war. And we have the feeling that we are still in the mid of this war, if not in the beginning, to say. While the whole world and the whole media, international media, Arab media, Israeli media, are focusing during the last couple of days and weeks on the northern part of this war, on Lebanon, the situation is in Gaza is becoming much more crucial and worse. There are daily massacres against the Palestinian people in the northern part of Gaza. And I have the feeling that, or the impression that the Israeli government and the Israeli army are using this focus, international, global focus on Lebanon and what's going on in Lebanon in order to complete what they started actually a year ago in Gaza. We need to remember that. I'm sorry to start in this way, but this is the reality. And the second point, I will tell you something personal political, because I cannot separate between both. Since this war started and since October 7th, I knew that everything will be different after that. Gaza will be different. I am going to be different. The whole Palestinian question, and all of us, Israelis and Palestinians, we are going to be different and in a different position. But during the last couple of weeks, I'm moving in my life and in the world with a very strong, deep, scary feeling that if the war doesn't stop, if there will be no international intervention to stop this war and to bring both sides or all sides in the region to negotiate a better future for all of us. And because I'm Palestinian and I'm speaking from the very basic fact of my personal national position, there will be no Palestinian question in the meaning of the collective national being and existence of the Palestinian people in this place to speak about before speaking about the two-state solution or about any other solution. And I'm really afraid we are there. We are on the way very fast toward this. Okay, having said all of that, still, all of these understanding, personal political understandings, don't change actually the principles and the values that I believe and all of us at Land for All believe to be the basics behind our political vision. And I will tell you about them very shortly. First of all, we need to acknowledge that the reality in Israel-Palestine between the Jordan and the river is a bi-national reality. We have two national groups. We cannot ignore that. And the second point, both of these groups claim their belonging and their right of belonging to this place as their homeland. The third principle, accordingly, you know, all of these principles and values are interconnected, intersected even, is if we acknowledge these two facts, we can move to the third one, that all people from both national groups have the right to live under equality. Individual equality, but also collective equality. And collective equality means, speaking about national groups, the right of self-determination of both people, of both national groups, in terms of sovereign, independent nation states. In order to be able to agree about these principles and go forward, speaking about the legal, constitutional, and political form, how to translate them, we need to remember or to ensure another two important principles. And these are recognition, mutual recognition, and historic reconciliation. We need to acknowledge all of these principles, but also we need to acknowledge the collective memory and history of both people. And we need to acknowledge the historic sentimental attachment of both people. And to acknowledge the collective traumas when we come to speak about political solutions. And we need also to integrate in our political vision the elements of transitional justice and reconciliation. It's not enough to speak about peace and negotiations and signing agreements to implement a solution of the conflict. So these actually the most important values and principles, and the last one, and then I will give you my to continue what I started and how we translate all of these values into our political vision, is the need to have, when speaking about Israel-Palestine, to have a paradigm shift, moving from the whole concept of speaking even about the two-state solution from segregation and separation into integration and sharing this place according or based on all of these principles and mutual recognition. And to have a paradigm shift from the segregation, the zero-sum game that some people on both sides are speaking about, into having an agreed form of how to continue living together and separately in this place.
Thank you, Rula. That's really helpful background. And I think that it certainly raises the question of how to translate those values into the political framework. So I'll turn it over to Mai. I just want to say something I didn't say before. We will leave about 20 minutes, maybe 15. We'll see how much we have to talk about for questions. So you can feel free to send your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end. But let me ask Mai, without further ado, please, if you can spell out the actual political vision that we are thinking about.
Thanks, Dalia and Rula. I'll just first of all acknowledge we had a technical problem, and so I know that a few people, or quite a lot of people, joined a few minutes later than others, and so just welcome to everyone. I'm sorry for the technical issue. We're here now. You're just on time. The time is now. So welcome. I will also just I'll try to make this disclaimer or this opening remark very short, but just to say that I think that we all feel somewhere in our bodies and mind how historic this moment is, and how tragic it is, and how traumatic it is, and I think that it's important that we start with acknowledging the reality, which is extremely dire and getting honestly really worse by the day, and it's not linear; it's just expanding exponentially worse every day. But I also want to say that the setting of the work, and this connects to the values of what we do, or maybe to the why, is that there is no other choice. So for us as Israelis and Palestinians who are doing this work, we are doing this, yes, because of equality, and yes, because of the right for self-determination, and yes, because of the commitment to everything that Rula said. But the first value, honestly, is to save our lives, or to ensure a future for our children. And so I don't know if this is a value, but I want to say that that's the drive and what makes us, really try to do everything in our might. And just like on my Zoom, I have like the 5 people on I have Eve and Gilad and Dalia and Rula and me who work at A Land for All, but we are hundreds of people who are committed to doing everything in our power through A Land for All to stop this war and move as fast as possible towards a peace agreement. So because otherwise we will, at this point, Israelis and Palestinians are interconnected in such ways and interdependent in such ways that we either die together or live together. That is the reality right now. We either die together, which is what's happening right now, in various ways. I think that the Israeli government is also destroying Israel and Israeli society and Israel's democracy on the way. But we're also dying. And the Palestinian situation all around the homeland is just beyond, not only in Gaza. Or we live together. And if we want to live, the only way to live is to find a way to do that together, because no one is going anywhere. We have 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Israelis in this homeland. And fortunately or unfortunately, no one's going anywhere. So I think that that's really important. The starting point is that there's no other choice. This is not a theoretical conversation. So now I'll try to lay out, kind of translate what Rula said into the political program that we have created. It's important to say that this is a co-created political program created by Israelis and Palestinians over hundreds of meetings and hundreds of hours and hundreds of people that have met in order to lay down the principles and the values and the commitment to the reality on the ground, to the facts on the ground, to what has worked and what has failed, both in Israel, Palestine, both in the Middle East, and all around the world, and learning and integrating that knowledge and what has changed in the past 30 years internationally and locally, whether it's climate change, whether it's security, whether it's safety, whether it's everything, and integrating that into what we call a two-state solution that can work. So what is this two-state solution that can work? Number one, two states. Very important to say, we have a lot of questions about that. We are normally assumed to be a one-state solution. We are not. We are a two-state solution. Two states, Israel and Palestine, two sovereign, independent, democratic states with a border, the 67 border, two states. Have I said it enough times, Dalia? Okay. Number two, we have two clear differentiations from the classic two states. Number one, shared institutions. And here I encourage you to use your political imagination and think not only about the history of France and Germany, but the European Union today. There needs to be a translation of the interdependency of Israelis and Palestinians at this point to joint institutions to manage both equally and sustainably things that need to be managed jointly, not in any way to undermine the sovereignty of the states. However, if you think about climate, water, certain issues of economy, certain issues of security, certain issues of public health, all these things cannot be done separately in an effective and sustainable way. Okay? Whether it's water or air pollution or COVID or and honestly, security, right? And we always give this awful example that in the places that the security was based the most on segregation and separation, Gaza, with $1 billion wall and 16 years of siege and all the segregation measures that you can imagine, that's where I have no words to say what happened on October 7th. But we know how to collaborate on security issues. We do that all the time. Palestinians have no security, but we've enjoyed a certain amount of security. And so I say that because it's a difficult example. Jerusalem, I mean, everything I will touch now, I will try to, okay, so joint institutions, taking care jointly on the issues that we have to take care jointly. We just have to. Number two, second differentiation is moving towards gradually, eventually, with the full commitment to security and safety of Israelis and Israel and of Palestinians and Palestine towards a reality of a porous border, of freedom of movement, and eventually a version of freedom of residency. And again, here I encourage you, if this sounds like fantasy to you, to think about France and Germany, who 80 years ago were after 200 years of a very, very much even bloodier war than this. And today the border is completely open. And so I say that because that's the vision. That doesn't mean that we're offering to do that tomorrow. But this vision, as Rula said, answers the needs of the people, of both self-determination and the connection and the emotional attachment to the homeland. It answers the classic deadlocks of the two-state solution that have not been answered in 30 years, that have not been addressed in 30 years. And it creates a vision with hope and trajectory and values and a future picture that can actually create that political hope and political will in both people because it has been co-created. This is not a matter of negotiation, this vision. It's a matter of actual co-creation and partnership. And that leads us to the paradigm shift that Rula said about moving away from segregation and separation that hasn't worked anywhere around the world into a form of integration and partnership and equality.
Thank you, Mai. Would you like to say a word just about those particular aspects that have presented such obstacles in the past to the old two-state negotiations, such as Jerusalem settlements and refugees and borders?
Yeah, so yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I'm happy to let you do that as well, Dalia, if you feel compelled.
No, I'm not happy to either.
So the classic deadlocks of the two-state solution, that I think is also kind of, in a way, the story of a land for all, of people who have come together after realizing that what we've been advocating for is not going to work. And after we have kind of lost belief in the classic two states, and therefore have felt very what's desperate or lacking conviction that we can change something. Because if we advocate for the classic two states, but when we go on the ground and see the reality, we know it's not going to be able to work, that gap creates a lack of belief. And belief is a very important thing in political change. And so a land for all, in a way, is that kind of people, experts, activists, lawyers, academics, I mean, coming together to come and see what can we do. We know what the deadlocks are. We know what reality says. We know where our values lie. What are we going to do about it? And created this thing. So here's a few anecdotes. If we're not going to address the Palestinian refugee issue, we will not have an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. And so in this vision, Palestinian refugees could return to their homeland, which is Yafo and Akko and Haifa and Lod. There's a principle at Land for All that you don't try to rectify one injustice by creating another, which I think is a very important commitment. But the fact that Palestinians will be able to live in historic Palestine, which is their home, is very, very important. However, the way that we try to address this is by creating a differentiation, and again, think about the Schengen Agreement and about the EU, between residence and citizenship. So in our vision, Jews will be able to live in Palestine as permanent residents with no supremacy, with no occupation, with no military control. But Jews will be able to live and reside in Palestine, and Palestinians would be able to live and reside in Israel. But the Palestinians, and here I'm not talking about Palestinian citizens of Israel who remain Palestinian citizens of Israel, but other Palestinians will not be able to vote in Israel. They will vote in Palestine. Again, like Germans in France and French and German. And so with that, we actually kind of deal with two main issues, the settlements and the refugees. However, we don't fall into the pitfalls and the fears, not of security and not of the awful term of demographic threat, but creating an Israeli state and a Palestinian state and having that kept. Jerusalem in our vision is a shared city, very important. And I think that anyone who's been to Jerusalem knows that there is no, I mean, it's possible to put a wall in the middle, but I don't think anyone in their right mind would do that. And I think that if you think of water, which has always been such a key issue in the conflict, and you think about how that connects to climate or public health and etc., you understand that the water needs, and that has always been the common sense. Water needs to be shared jointly, managed jointly, because natural resources are something that is everyone's. And so also moving us towards that direction.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to say that we have lots to say and our time is going fast. So I'm going to move into the next set of questions. I'll just move back to Rula just to keep it going back and forth. And we're getting a lot of questions here, and we already wanted to talk about it. What is our organization? How is the organization built? Who's in it? And how has it been received? What is the openness and attention to this among our publics? Maybe Rula, would you like to start just to keep going with back and forth?
Yeah, well, the organization actually in the sense, in the meaning of the institutional existence is new, maybe 3 years old. And last year we decided to move into a real shared board, shared Palestinian-Israeli organization. And we found ourselves actually during the last year in the mid of building a kind of new bi-national organization, Palestinian-Israeli, although the idea itself and the vision itself exists since maybe 12 years. We are based mainly in Tel Aviv and in Ramallah. We have teams here in Tel Aviv and there in Ramallah. I'm saying here in Tel Aviv because by accident I'm now in Tel Aviv. And we have two main components of our work, very big components actually, and they are divided on the bi-national level, but also globally. So the first one is the public and political engagement and advocacy, which we do in Palestine, in Israel, and globally. And we do it on several levels, top down with politicians, with stakeholders, with policy people, but we do it also with on the grassroots level. We are in interaction with people on the ground. And we do it also in the space in between the grassroots and the decision makers. And it means the whole civil society organizations, peace organizations, all activists in the peace building movement, but not only, also think tanks and policy institutions. We are in interaction with all of these people. And you know what, I think you know that, Dalia, our language actually became the language that people use. Shared homeland, nobody is going anywhere. We have two national groups and so on, and the need for a political vision and etc. The second component, big component of our work, which is very new, that we decided about during this year because of the interaction that or the intensive exposure that we had about our political vision. We realized that we need to elaborate our political vision and also be able to articulate it in terms of practicalities and policy for the decision makers, in order to be able to replace the old practicalities and policies of the old two-state solution. And that's why we established a research and policy department. We are in the establishment phase, and we are committed, and thankfully we got also a generous grant for the establishment phase of this research and policy department. We are working on that in order to articulate our political vision and to transform it into policy orientations for the decision makers when they start speaking about how actually to start moving from this disaster that we are in into thinking about the political vision.
Great, thank you. What about the reception? Mai, maybe would you like to talk about the reception of these ideas in the organization's engagement, particularly with the region, with Israelis, with Palestinians? What have been the kind of responses, even anecdotally, in the conversations? What kind of questions, criticism, support?
Yeah. So I'll use this question to say what I think that a lot of people are thinking about, and we're very engaged in this discourse right now, which is a little bit of like, why is this the time to talk about political vision, right? And I think that that's a question that we get too often. And I think that it's worth addressing here so that we can all kind of integrate these answers into the way that we think about it and can echo them outside, because I think that we all have the responsibility to talk about political vision. And I think that we have been somehow manipulated over the years to think that political vision is not important when it comes to Israel-Palestine, even right now. So maybe I'll start by going back and say that, for 20 years, it's been pretty clear that the two-state solution, the classic two-state solution, has become, unfortunately, I say that with a broken heart, as we said earlier, it has become an empty shell. And for decision makers and people in power, or not only people in power, but states and governments and international community, it has become a fig leaf to say the two-state solution, but actually maintain what we call the fake status quo. Or we have other very advanced words for this, right? Shrinking the conflict, managing the conflict, anything we can do in order to not solve the conflict, to get it off the president's table, as they say in the US. And in a way, I think that a lot of us have been complicit in that. in accepting the fact that this conflict is beyond resolution. It's the hardest conflict, will never be solved. It's more complicated than any other conflict in all the history of all of the world. And I think that October 7th, and I hope that that no one would imagine that I will justify what happened on October 7th. But October 7th, we're not talking about the war now. We're talking about the conflict. October 7th is a symptom of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It doesn't stand alone by itself. And so the only way to end the war is a political solution, is to acknowledge that we need to solve this conflict now. And in order to end the war, and the war needed to end a long time ago and needs to end as soon as possible, you need to connect the end of the war to a political vision in order to have a Palestinian sovereign state side by side with an Israeli sovereign state. Because right now we're talking about the two-state solution, but there's one state that controls both. And we're talking about a two-state solution, but no one believes it will happen. And we're talking about two-state solution, but we haven't addressed the core issues of how to get to that two-state solution. And so what I'm saying is that we have been feeling this two things happening at the same time. On one hand, I think that the Israeli society, and you're the expert on this, Dalia, is very entrenched in our trauma, and very far from even imagining a better future, or just we're very in our trauma. And I think that there's a lot of disbelief, and I have to admit that the fact that this war is ongoing for more than a year is no one expected this to happen. And I think that we were hoping that the 7th of October would be the end of the imagination that this conflict can be managed and not solved. And at the same time, I want to say that A Land for All has grown by thousands of percent. We have been meeting thousands of people, thousands of organizations and initiatives and groups and people from Israel and Palestine, around the Middle East. We've been invited to give presentations to foreign ministers and heads of states in the Middle East, in the EU, in the EU Parliament, in the member states, in the State Department, in the National Security Council. I mean, we have been really all over the place. And what we're hearing from people is this feeling of, wow, maybe this conflict can actually be solved with a vision that can work, that is pragmatic, that makes sense, that is created by Israelis and Palestinians from the ground. And so I think that that's really what keeps us going, right? That's what gives us hope, that this is making sense to people who have been doing this for years.
Thank you. I'm going to try to reiterate a couple of points that I think might address some of the questions that we're getting in. I've got a list of some of the questions that Eve has helped curate, and there are many of them. And so because I was also asked to weigh in a little bit for my own, engagement in this, I'll try to both give a tiny summary and maybe address some of the questions along the way. So just to reiterate what we're talking about, two separate states, which recognizes both the right of the existence of two nations, the right of national self-determination of each one in a territorial zone roughly along the 67 lines. There can be adjustments if the two sides through negotiations agree on those adjustments, but the main principle is to have viable sovereignty for the Palestinian side, which means land contiguity. How do we defuse the obstacle of Israel not wanting to give up its presence? By unlocking the opposition with this mechanism of disconnecting residency and citizenship so that people who can live on the other side, so it's not as threatening to them to have to give up territory. But let me just clarify, people can have residency on the other side if they respect the sovereignty and the law of the other side. This is not a blanket privilege. People who disrupt violate the law or don't recognize the sovereignty, but maybe there's more of an objective approach to violating the law, can lose the right to be on the other side. Now, that does not mean that people lose the right to vote. We've had a few questions about this. There is a distinction between being able to vote in local elections where people live, like you would. And, there's also been questions about how is this different or similar to the US, a federated state, versus the European Union, which is separate states with a looser association. But both of them have components of allowing people who are permanent residents to vote in their local elections, which makes sense, while having their national election, their national franchise in the country of their nation, which preserves the need of each side to feel like it is living in a country where it has a sort of electoral community, an electorate that reflects its national identity, but that each side has access to the other side as a recognized right. Part of the understanding of their heritage is that they have the right to residency under the conditions we said, the right to travel, visit, study, work. That opens up economic opportunities and also reflects the actual interdependency. And so I think that, those principles have to be understood. And Jerusalem, of course, is a core component of this. It's not going to be divided because anybody who has ever been to Jerusalem or has even seen the map of Jerusalem should know that there is no straight line through Jerusalem and the populations are deeply interdependent. A couple of other points. How is this connected? And again, I'm summarizing some of the questions. How is this connected to the need to stop the fighting immediately? Is it not a distraction to think about long-term, future-oriented plans that will take a very long time to build and implement? Our starting point that we understood quickly, or at least we came to realize quickly after the war, is that the policy being made on the ground right now with relation to the war or any form of de-escalation of the war will determine the permanent structures of the long-term future. And I can give you the current direction that is being dictated by the Israeli government. The current direction is that as of yesterday, the cabinet has approved a plan, and we don't know how serious this is for implementation, by which the IDF takes over the distribution of humanitarian aid in Gaza. Now, that sounds very in the weeds for now, but what it means is that while nobody was watching or paying attention to it, the Israeli government is laying the groundwork for a military government in Gaza, and that will, in the long term, become the kind of military government that leads to permanent occupation, and who knows what happens after that. By contrast, we're imagining that in the immediate future, in the immediate present, there is an urgent need, for example, to rebuild Gaza's health system. There is an urgent need to stop disease from spreading in Gaza. First of all, none of that can happen without a ceasefire. We, of course, advocate unreservedly for a ceasefire and end to this war. But even those immediate needs can be resolved through the kinds of incipient mechanisms like joint cooperation on the professional level with the approval of the governments for urgent needs that neither side can deny, no matter which political ideology they hold. Everybody has to stop the spread of polio. It's just one example, but it's the kind of example that in the longer term future will lead to the kind of cooperative structures that are ultimately necessary for two states under any approach. So that's in terms of how we see the connection between the immediate urgency of ending the war and putting in place the structures to do it in a way that will set the path for this kind of vision. There's a lot of questions about public opinion and how can people trust each other? What is the reception for this plan? Let me put this out there that as a public, in my hat as a public opinion researcher and a political strategist, there are times when the public really can drive something forward, and there are times when leadership has to drive the policy and the debate forward. This is not a time when the public on either side, Israelis or Palestinians, are about to drive forward anything. They are too busy. They are consumed with grief and survival. And they are consumed with, everything, all the accompanying feelings of trauma and distrust. And let's face it, there's also hatred. If we wait for people to rebuild a sense of trust until something changes at the policy level, it will never happen. There is no magical message. There is no campaign. There is no poster or slogan that will change the minds of Israeli or Palestinians right now. The only thing that will change people's minds is a change of their lived experience. And therefore, until better policies are implemented that A, stop the war, B, disincentivize violence, okay, C, offer opportunities, and that highlight the interdependence and allow people to actually grasp those opportunities. That's the only thing that will change people's attitudes in the long-term future. And I don't think we can afford to wait until people magically develop a sense of trust, which they won't in the ongoing circumstances that we are seeing today. So that's in terms of where public opinion is. Let's face it, it's not good, but that's true of all political solutions based on a democratic or democratic frameworks that recognize the need for self-determination. So I'm just looking at some of the other questions here. For example, how do we deal with extremists in both sides? I mean, I think this is a critical question. And again, it is something that applies to any political framework that involves concessions. But I'm going to start off the answer, and then I would love for my colleagues to weigh in on this. I think that the starting point is that we have tried to identify those people within the parties that are typically opposed to the two-state approach based on partition, in which it is zero sum. Each side loses access to the other side, and they have to accept that. And that was alienating to enormous parts of Israelis and Palestinians. And as a result, there are people who might have been open to a kind of political solution if it wasn't such a zero-sum game. And so we are saying we're not going to vilify people who oppose the old versions of a two-state solution, not because of their political positions and not because of their religious identity. We see a shared interest, okay? From our perspective, from a liberal perspective, we think people have, to have equal rights and equal access and better opportunities, et cetera. And we understand that from a religious, cultural, and historic perspective, there are people who would have been in the opposition in the zero-sum version, who are more attracted to this idea because it recognizes their reality. And in their reality, they have an indelible connection to the other side, even if they can't own it. So we're saying each side has to make a concession in terms of owning the other side, but they understand that we are reaching out across our internal divides to say we're not blaming you, we're not alienating you. We even recognize that it is critical and what we call a sacred value to have your connection to the whole land recognized, but there have to be political pragmatic limitations on that. So that helps, kind of identify the nuances within the opposition. And I think that the other reality I would say is that there is no society in the world without extremists. There will never be a society without some extremists. The point is to get as many people as possible to be able to sign on to something by offering the kind of items and policies that reflect where we have shared interests. Rula and Mai, would you like to weigh in on that question? If you do, please do. And if not, I will ask you some of the other questions that have come up, which are excellent questions and challenging. Yeah.
Well, I fully agree with you. We cannot guarantee that we won't have in the future any extremists on both sides. I think it's the nature of the human beings and the nature of states and societies. So I think, you know what, no, I don't want to deal with this question because it's not realistic to start thinking about if we are going to have extremists or not. But I would like to say maybe 2 points regarding the previous part, Dalia, that you were speaking about. We cannot speak about ceasefire and about ending the war without having a clear political vision. And we cannot speak about a political vision without stopping the war. This is the first point. The second point, we need also to stop or to transform our terminology when we speak about the two-state solution from putting this opportunity on the willing of the Israeli side, the society as well as the government. It's not about them if they agree or not agree according to the polls or according to their, scares or fears. It's a right of the Palestinian people. Palestine is acknowledged. And it's about the historic right of the Palestinian people of self-determination here in their homeland. And it's important. We cannot continue speaking the same language and explaining that we cannot have a solution now because the Israeli government is not the right one, and because the Israeli society is not prepared now to have a solution. Please, we cannot continue also this conversation according to this way of thinking. We have here two people who claim the right of self-determination, and both of them need to have this right. And the last point, we have one of the two states. So let's speak about how we acknowledge the second one.
Okay, I'm going to be very rude, and Mai, if you don't mind, I'll move on to two final questions, and you can take them or you can ask us to take them, but we have very little time left. We want to respect the time of our participants. One is we're getting a lot of questions about what about the other options? Why not one state? Why not one single democratic binational state for everybody? I think that's a critical one to answer, although it goes along with other questions like why not go back to the old two states, or what about the Holy Land Confederation project run by our colleagues Yossi Beilin and Hiba Husseini and other people. So maybe if one of you can relate to other approaches towards conflict resolution, and do we communicate with them? How does the organization work with them? And the last question that I will leave it to the two of you to answer is what our participants can do if they have been sufficiently motivated or maybe even inspired, we hope, to help. You'll have to choose who takes which
question. So we have 2 minutes to do all of that.
Well, I'm going to give you a 2-minute extension, so you have 5 minutes altogether.
Okay.
I hope our participants can stay for an extra 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'll start by saying that a land for all, and it's really it is such a challenge to say so much in such little time, and I really offer or suggest reading our vision paper. I think it's an inspiring piece. It's pretty short, and I think that it has a lot of the answers to the questions. And I really recommend reading it even as an exercise in political imagination. We are so low these days that we can't imagine anything. But I think committing to political imagination these days is an act of resistance. I think that committing to political imagination and a vision is not a privilege or even should not be a choice. It has to be an active action because, and we said it a bunch of times, but it's important for me to say, without a political vision, there cannot be political change. There cannot be political change. If we don't know where we're going, we will never get there. And apropos extremists on both sides, one of the lessons from Oslo is that if you don't have an end game that is very clear, you leave it to spoilers to take it away. So we have to be very clear right now where we want to get to. It won't be perfect. It won't be easy. It will probably not look as we imagine it. But if we don't use this power of imagination and hope, which is an activity, something active we do, we will never get there. And we will never see the political change in Israel because we have neglected presenting a vision for 20 years. And that has been a huge detriment to the progressive camp or the peace camp. We haven't been able to galvanize hope and change. Okay, I'm taking it to, I'll just say one.
Some people might have to go exactly as we planned at 9, so I want everybody to hear the part about what can they do to help.
Okay.
And then we can take another couple minutes and finish the other
I think that what can be done right now is, first of all, knowing that Israelis and Palestinians, by the thousands, are committed to doing this work every day on the ground. We are doing the work. We are here against all odds. It's a miracle that the Land for All is together, but it's not a miracle. A Land for All moved to a joint board of 7 Palestinians and 7 Israelis on October 10th. That was our first joint meeting. I say this to tell you that when people say there's nothing that can be done, it's impossible, Israelis and Palestinians don't want peace, that is not true. And we are here to show you, and we are happy to engage with you more. Number 2, join us. Join us. Write about us. Tell people about us. Connect us to decision makers. I mean, we welcome everything. Donations, attention, communications, media, everything. People need to know that this exists. And I think that the third component is trying to let go of what we know is not going to work and replace it with something that can, that is aligned with our values and aligns with what reality tells us. And that is moving away from segregation into integration and equality and partnership and collaboration when we speak about Israel-Palestine and when we speak about the day after or the future. We've been doing this work. Please be a part of it, because this is a historic moment that if we don't capture now, I don't know what to say. We might never have another I don't know. This is the opportunity to do it. Okay, let's not let's not start breaking down in tears right now. But this is the time to take action. This is the time. There's no other time.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's the final message for me.
Great. Rula, would you like to have a final message by answering those questions, or you can sum up in your own words if you like?
I think Mai did a very good sum up, but maybe I articulate to one question: why not other forms of the binational or one democratic state? I think we are not against all of these platforms, programs, visions. I do believe that it could be the most good solution for all of us to open the borders and to live in one state and so on. But it's not realistic. I think at this time it's not realistic to speak about one state solution. The only one state that we can imagine, according to the gap of the powers between both sides, and according to the current political vision that is becoming the mainstream of the latest governments in Israel, the one state is going to be an apartheid state. And in order to go to the one state, we need a lot of time. We need a lot of deconstructing and reconstructing the whole structure, the whole national narratives of both people. And we think we cannot do that in a very good way, because of the current situation, that it will take us automatically to an apartheid state. And we believe that our political vision has already components of a federative system and a one-state system, but still connected to the desires of both people. Now, we are not speaking about after 50 years. Now, both people, because of many reasons that we don't have the time to discuss this evening, both people want now to have their own secured, insured national state or nation states. Later on, what people decide to do with these two states, they are free to do it. So we need at this point to start by having equal rights and equal security and safety for both people. And we see that it's doable only if we speak about two states, but about, again, our specific version of the two states that has already integrative aspects and elements that can lead people to open borders gradually and to rethink, to revision their lives. But I do believe that it will take another more decades.
Let me wrap up with my own very, very minimal summary, just to say that there are a lot of questions about how to do this now and how, shouldn't we be focused on stopping the fighting? Let me point out that Israel has benefited from creating a situation of a policy and constitutive gray zone. Ambiguity, amorphousness, lack of decisions have led to what we see now. Israel can sort of say, well, we don't really have borders, and therefore we actually own all of it. And if nobody is presenting an alternative to what the current Israeli government is presenting, we continue with that gray zone. And in that gray zone, we know where it goes because we've been living with it for decades. That gray zone is continued occupation, continued inequality, Israeli annexation. Nobody's offering the alternative now, and therefore we're never going to get there in the future. So to reiterate what my colleagues have said, that is why we are working on a vision now that seems very remote. We don't pretend that it solves every problem perfectly. We don't believe in utopia. We think this is more realistic. And we don't pretend it can happen overnight. But we think that if we don't start now, actually, one of a great intellectual from the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa said the time for fighting for justice is always now. So I'll end on that. That's Albie Sachs. And just to say a couple of technical points, that first of all, thank you everybody for joining. There's been a lot of questions about how to watch this if you if you want to see it afterwards. The recording and the link will be available with all the material will be available and will be sent to everybody who registered after this. You'll be able to find on the website, you'll be able to read about the vision. You can take your time and read it more in depth. You'll find other articles, materials, both written by the organization and by all of us separately on the website. You can always get in touch with us, and feel free to invite anybody from our community to speak in your communities if you think of other people and communities who need to hear this message. And just to let you know, you're not alone in joining. We've actually, since October 7th, we've pretty much been mobbed by inquiries from the international community, from foreign governments, from educational communities, universities. Everybody wants to know about it. And we've had, lots of interest, even here in this very troubled region. So thank you for joining us, and we welcome your continued engagement.